Welcome to the Vision for Life podcast, an ongoing conversation between the pastors of Fellowship Denver and the church at large. Each week we talk about life, faith, the Bible, and how to follow Jesus as we go about our daily lives. I'm Autumn, host of the Vision for Life podcast. The basis for everything we discuss on this podcast is God's revelation of himself to us. God's revelation surrounds us. His revelation of himself brings wisdom and clarity to those who lack the ability to see. It provides us with a unique spiritual light, which allows us to see things that we couldn't previously, unaided by God's word and by God's Spirit. Today, I'm joined by Hunter.
Hi,
welcome.
Autumn. Great to be with you.
Yes, good to have you on the podcast again. And we have another guest today. Joanna Meyer is joining us. Hello, Joanna.
Hi, you guys.
Joanna works for the Denver Institute for Faith and Work. And Joanna, first, would you just let us know a little bit about the organization that you work for and your role there?
Yeah, I'm the Director of Public Engagement at the Institute. It's a 501c3 nonprofit. We're an educational organization that's networked to churches in Denver, and our focus is on helping people understand a biblical vision for their work and living that out and loving God and serving their neighbors and having influence in our city. So we do things like public events. We host a podcast of our own. We run a fellowship program. And again, we partner with churches. So it's a really fun job.
Joanna is a professional podcaster, and so
I don't know about that.
The level of this conversation is fixing to go through the roof.
That's right. It was a good ask. Good ask to have Joanna on today.
That's right. Hey, our listeners should also know it's Super Bowl Sunday, and Autumn is sitting here in her Tom Brady jersey.
Or for those of us that maybe are not football fans, it's Superb Owl Sunday.
That's right. That's right. Hunter is joking. I definitely am not wearing a jersey, nor am I a Tom Brady fan.
Spicy.
But it is Super Bowl Sunday. That is true. So of the things that you just said, that is true.
Do you have some queso in the crock pot?
Nope, I don't. But we will have some food this evening. So Jesse does, though. Jesse's got the queso going, and he has plans for watching the Super Bowl and eating well while doing it. But today, we asked Joanna on because we are talking about work. Work is how we spend a significant amount of our time, and we're going to talk about how work has meaning, how God wove meaning into our work. So, as we shift away from the Super Bowl, away from superb owls, and towards our conversation about work today, we're going to talk about work within four specific considerations about how God created work and how we can think about it. So first, we're going to discuss work as provision.
I think it's important to say our work has meaning, which is just a way of saying it fits into a bigger story of what God is doing in us and in the world, and we want to discover that meaning. So we don't actually have to bring meaning to our work or add meaning to our work. It already has meaning, but often we're not aware of it. So these things we're going to talk about hopefully help us discover meaning and purpose that might be residing in our work right now that we don't see. And the verse when you said is work as provision. And by provision, we simply mean that work is a way that God has created. It's the way God has created for us to provide for our daily needs. And I would say also to provide for our enjoyment as well. Mm-hmm. We see that in the pattern where God rested at the end of his work and enjoyed it. And so God intends to provide both for our needs and for our joy in our work.
Yeah, it's fascinating. As we were thinking about what we wanted to talk about today, I said, well, let's take a step back and say, why did God give us work? Mm-hmm. And that idea of provision is part of it. It's a way for us to meet our basic needs. The scripture's really clear that work is to be part of our human existence. But I think if you take a step back, you realize we work because God works and he made us in his image. Like the very first thing that we see about God in scripture in Genesis 1 is that he is at work creating the world. And when he makes us in his image, it means be like God. God works. And that's powerful because it makes you realize that work is a good thing. Often popular culture treats work like it's a hassle or a burden, and we only do it because we have to. country music is filled with metaphors like that of like, it's 5 o'clock somewhere. Like, let me get my work day over so I can start drinking, or referring to work as the daily grind. But really you realize like, oh, we work because we're made to be like God, and he works. And that it's a beautiful, blessed way that we live out his image. That can be very theoretical, but it does change how you think about work, realizing that it's something that God has built into our DNA, is to be engaging the world in productive ways.
It's more than a necessary evil.
Yep.
You're saying it's not just a Genesis 3, post Genesis 3 reality. There is a curse on our work. It does have thorns and thistles. I'm sure we'll talk about that, but it precedes Genesis 3.
Yeah.
And so it's not just about enduring this evil until 5 o'clock.
Yeah. And realizing that we're made to work, you realize that work is not just limited to a paycheck. Everybody from childhood to their death is productively engaging the world. So kids have work. Their work doesn't get a paycheck, but their work is to learn and to play. Retirees have work. Their work is to be a blessing and to share wisdom with younger generations. That sense of engaging life around us in a purposeful way is not limited to a paycheck.
And along those lines, then, if we're talking about work as provision, we need to be careful that we're not just saying earning money, because sometimes our work that doesn't pay us, or we don't get a paycheck, we don't sell something as a result of it, it still provides something. So our work is bigger than just doing a job, and it provides something for ourselves, for our family. It may provide something we need, or it may provide something that we enjoy, and that is meaningful.
Yeah. Studs Terkel was a famous historian. He did audio interviews with working class folks for his book, Working. And he said that work is the search for meaning in the search for daily bread. That sense of like, we're earning our daily bread, but we always wonder, is there a deeper purpose for what's here? And I think that's something we really wrestle with, and something many Christians have not been discipled to consider. They often treat their work like it's checking out of maybe their walk with God. They go into work and then they come home and they're with their family, which has value, or they're involved with church activities, which has value. And they don't see that the work itself is a profound way to be experiencing God, serving him, loving our neighbors.
I think perhaps another direction that could go is, as opposed to thinking your work doesn't meaning, placing an emphasis on your work in that it is supposed to provide a sort of meaning that may be misplaced, as opposed to understanding this within the framework that you just talked about, Joanna and Hunter, and that it is connected to and serves this greater purpose. And yet if that purpose becomes too self-focused, then seeking meaning through work can also take a place that it wasn't intended to. And sometimes then that the work as provision aspect of our work can get lost if we are looking to it as a means of self-fulfillment or finding a meaning in it that is particularly self-directed.
Another way to say that might be, it's okay sometimes just to work a job because it provides income and sustainability for yourself, for your family, and sets you up maybe to do other things that are meaningful and enjoyable.
And that provision, providing for yourself and your family, that is meaningful. The second aspect of work that we want to consider today is work as formation.
If you think about what the word form means, it just means to give shape to something, often by arranging, by removing certain parts, and crafting it. So when we're saying work is formation, we mean this: God uses work to shape and form us into glorious representations of his image. So work itself, just doing work, has a shaping, forming effect on men and women. And that should be a sanctifying or a growing effect it has on us. So I do think it's important to look at your work and ask, how is God using my work, again, broadly defined, to shape me and to mold me?
So much to say, so much to say, because I think one of the challenges as a person of faith is that we run into the ways that the world thinks about work. And there's so many false ideas or expectations that we put on work that just the work itself cannot support. I think one of them is the idea that If you just found the ideal job for yourself, then work wouldn't be hard. And if you are a fan of Pinterest, or if you look at Instagram, you look at the influencers and they'll often have like a little hand calligraphied sign that says, do what you love and you'll never work a day in your life. And I think that's an impossible burden for work to bear. It's not designed to be that way. The reality is, as we look at Genesis 1, work is a good thing. It's something that God gave us at the earliest moments of creation for us to live out. But work is not easy. And so as we follow the biblical story, the same forces of brokenness and sin and restoration and redemption, they play out in the context of our daily work. And so the idea that work would be a bit of a struggle is normal. That's part of the biblical story. I think about Genesis 3:18 talks about when the curse is given to men and women, that the ground will produce thorns and thistles for you.
It's Hunter, you said that would come back around.
It's a hint of what is to come, that work is going to be hard. And it's so important to draw that distinction between what God desires for us to experience in work and the reality of it. And those thorns and thistles are what can be such a refining influence in our souls. I'd love to know from you guys, like, where do you experience thorns and thistles in your job?
Oh, just today the printer refused to work with me.
Technology, I think,
Yes.
is like a primary way that.
Well, Joanna, I like the way you just said you can be doing something you love, but it's still work.
Oh,
and
totally.
I get to experience it all the time. I have a job that I love, and I chose it, and I did a lot of work just to be able to do it. And still, there are just days when it's just hard, or it's frustrating, or things just don't go like I want it to. Today's sermon, I had a lot of fun preaching. It was work to prepare it, and it didn't come together nearly as quickly as I wanted it to. I remember on about midday Friday, I was like, I have a lot of great thoughts on Genesis 1. I've learned a lot about it. I have no idea how to put this together into a sermon, and then I had to do quite a bit of work to do that. And at a time when, honestly, I probably would have rather been doing something else with my Saturday than writing a sermon. Not all sermons are Saturday specials, but sometimes that happens.
Similarly to within this conversation, work as formation, similarly to how we've talked about other struggles or difficulties in life, this sort of difficulty in work presents us with this tension, but it is still a way that God is using to form and shape us. So the struggles that we face in work are not unredeemed within God's greater scheme. They are something that he then still uses to shape us and to grow us. And so we do live in this tension.
Yeah, I think about two kind of key biblical themes that are essential to think about in our own walk with God. And one is that grand narrative of creation, fall, redemption, and restoration flows right through the workplace, that any industry, any individual office, any individual person is living in that reality of the brokenness of sin in their lives. I mean, you can look at any industry and think, man, what is really jacked up about this field? Like the practice of law would be a great example. You could probably ask almost any lawyer to say, what's really messed up in the practice of law today? And they would probably have a long list. Or you could say, to someone that is working at an auto repair shop downtown, you could say like, hey, what's not great about where you work? And you could come up with those things. There are also things of beauty in all those places that can be amplified and reflect the goodness of God in the world. And so one of the challenges for us as we think about spiritual formation is that we are the same way. There are things that are broken and beautiful about all of us that happen in the context of work. And work brings it out. Work is that pressure cooker that shows our best selves, and it also shows our work selves. So think about the anxiety that you might feel when you sit down for your annual performance review. That's an opportunity for God to come alongside you to experience his peace and a sense of freedom from finding our identity in our work and finding it in God instead. Other examples would be idolatry, which you hinted at, Autumn, is that it's very easy to look at our work and make it substitute for God, or allowing it to achieve a level of importance in our lives that only God should have that place in our lives. Like, we can make almost anything an idol, and your job title or your commitment to your work schedule, anything like that can quickly become an idol. I even think lacking love for our neighbors. Workplaces are places where ambition is rewarded with advancement and promotions. And so realizing, how do we see those opportunities? How do we see ways that we're not allowing God to shape us, and then specifically inviting him into that process to be developing our souls? That's something we do a lot at Denver Institute, is helping people understand that what God does in your life through the experiences of the workplace can be as powerful as what happens in church. not that it's a substitute, but rather it's an integrated view of life. And I think that's so important. And that's that other theological principle is, understanding like what we're called to, what calling is. And so often when people think about their jobs, they want this clear, like lightning bolt in the sky that says, God says, go be a regional manager at Walmart. I don't think very many people have probably had that revelation.
God calls regional managers to Walmart with lightning bolts.
He does. But I do think sometimes we want to know, like maybe you're approaching college or some, educational formation experience. And you think,
Or having a midlife crisis.
Or having, in your 40s, maybe you're like, just don't like what you're doing. And you think, I wish God would just tell me exactly what he wanted me to do. But before he ever calls us to something specific, he calls us to some very general things that play out in any workplace. So he calls us to himself, a saving relationship with him. He calls us to a life of discipleship. He calls us to a life of service. And if those are the only things he tells you in life about what he wants you to do for your daily work, that's enough to keep you really busy. I mean, those are some pretty compelling marching orders right there. And so you realize that when you have an integrated view of calling, you see all of your life is living to God in response to those general callings he gives you. Suddenly your work matters. You realize like, oh yeah, this is where God's lordship will have to be worked out in my life, where I will have to learn to love and serve others, or when I will see God discipling me to understand him better and walk with him more faithfully in the context of working as a sales representative at Macy's down at Park Meadows Mall.
You're getting at something that is really important to acknowledge, which is every kind of work and every company or environment you could work in has something broken, or we could even say sinful about it. I can think, for example, one of my formative work experiences after college was I worked 8 years in the world of tax accounting. And in the world of tax accounting, there is a great temptation to make the numbers do what you want them to do to achieve the result you want on your taxes. That is an embedded temptation. And what good accounting does is it tells the truth. So one way I watch both myself and all young accountants really wrestle is how much do I go along with this pressure that may be being put on us to make the numbers do what we want them to do versus we're just going to tell the truth and let that lie where it needs to lie.
Yeah.
So in that example, you're experiencing the effect of sin in your own heart, the sort of way that can show up commonly within a particular work area, so that there are also these distortions due to sin that affect an environment in a specific way because it lends itself to a certain sort of temptation given the work that you're doing. And you also get to see then in unique ways through that work, the process of Christ working within that environment and within your heart and repairing certain aspects of it that have been distorted when you respond to him and allow the gospel to be present and alive in your heart and in your workplace. Yeah.
That's right. And so to go back to this is under work as formation, God uses us having to wrestle through those temptations, and all that exposes in us. For me, that might expose that I'm a people pleaser, or it might expose that I really want to move up the ladder at all cost, or it might expose all kinds of things. And God uses those temptations to expose what's in our own hearts and then to shape us and to refine us and hopefully to form us more into the image of Christ.
Yeah. Within this area of work as formation also, which leads into our next point, God uses work not only to shape us in the way you just described, Hunter, but also as a way in which he shapes the world around us through our work. So our third point is work as cultivation.
So if work as formation is about God shaping us, work as cultivation is about us shaping the world through the work that we do.
Yeah.
And here we go all the way back to what the original work was, which was gardening. Gardening is taking the potential and the resources of the soil and the seeds and creating an environment in which those seeds can grow and flourish. And so all work is cultivation. That's the
Yeah.
primal image of what
Leading
work
up
is.
to what? What is the culminating image that we see in Scripture? It's no longer a garden.
It's not a garden. It's a new city.
Yeah.
And so the work of civilization, of creating civilization, and this man and woman who were gardeners, they were also going to have children, and they were going to create a society.
Yeah.
So the whole work of creating a society and all the structures and of a society, that is what we mean by cultivation.
And that's powerful. That has some very significant ramifications for how we think about our daily lives. And at the core is the idea of that the created world matters. One of the distortions historically in the church throughout centuries has been this tendency to kind of separate from the things of daily life, like they might have been like dirty or hardworking or not as glorious as the things that were spiritual, and elevating the things that were kind of overtly about God. And sometimes that could be a really severe distortion where you would have only the religious leaders suggesting that only religious things mattered and the things of earth didn't matter at all. And really what you see in Scripture is that the earth matters. Christ died both for people and for all of life. Like, as it talks about Christ is coming and he's making all things new. When he says all things, he means all things. We joke about that at Denver Institute. We say that like all things means all things.
All things.
And I think we have to disciple people to be able to look at all of life and say, how are God's redemptive purposes being played out here? And then each person who follows Christ has a unique square of life, a unique area of influence where they can be engaging the world as it is to develop it more, to bring out the things of God, or to really be working redemptively in the things that really, really aren't the way God would want them to be.
And we hear that in Jesus' prayer too. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. God's plan of redemption is not just about us having a private spiritual experience, but it's also about redeeming and renewing the society of earth.
Yeah. And I appreciate what you have said, Hunter, is that it's not an either or proposition. Suddenly we don't say like, oh, we're going to stop telling people about Jesus and focus on thinking about how to infuse gospel principles at Arthur Anderson. No, it's this integrated view of God at work in all of life. He's redeeming people. He's also redeeming the created world. I find that when you help people have a big vision for their work and how God is at work, and you disciple them to really think critically about their industry or area of influence, their faith gains a lot of vibrancy because suddenly there's so much room for creativity and influence and inspiration of thinking about how God can work in new ways. I wish more people had an opportunity to see a life of faith being that broad and nuanced.
The way you just described that, Joanna, makes me think that it's exciting and inspiring because this gives us it really broadens our vision. It gives us this big vision of what the result of our work is, this sort of fruitfulness that's connected to something so much bigger than the individual tasks or the things that feel small in each day. It really is giving us an idea of how we are participating with God in this continued creative process. And that goes back again to Genesis 1 and what he invited the man and woman into when he told them that he placed them in the garden to keep it and tend it. And then it would grow, and the people who would join them, that they would participate in that process too. And it was exponentially bigger than just what they were doing.
Yeah. And to realize that our charge is to make something of this world. Hunter and I have been talking about a quote this week that he shared in today's sermon from an author named Albert Wolters. He writes,
That I stole from you.
Hey, happy to share. If it relates to faith and work, I like hand stuff out like Tic Tacs. I'm like, hey, you need to know about this. So here's a little snippet of that quote. I think it's a powerful one. He said, the earth had been completely unformed and empty. In the 6-day process of development, God had formed and filled it, but not completely. People must now carry on the work of development. By being fruitful, they must fill it even more. By subduing it, they must form it even more. Mankind as God's representatives on earth carry on where God left off. And it's amazing to think that God didn't finish the task. Like he didn't create this completely formed earth. He gave us these wonderful raw materials that he asked something to do with us. And I think it's especially important to realize that Christ's redemptive purposes fit in with that picture too. And so, we were talking about this before we hit record, that work is one of those overarching themes of scripture. And it can be challenging sometimes because we look for very specific verses that talk to us about how we should do our work. And I would argue that there are a handful of examples of that, but really, like, all of Scripture is a story of how we should go about our work, because we fit into that incredible narrative that God has built for us. And so the challenge is training our hearts and minds to be able to see our daily work, the task of driving a truck filled with Pepsi products, to figure out how we embody our unique place in that purpose that God has given us.
It's funny you mentioned that. I have a young man I've mentored for years. That's what he does. He drives a truck full of Pepsi products now. But it's good for us to ask, what has God given me dominion over every day? What has he given me dominion over? And it might be a lot or it might be a little, but what has he given me dominion over? And how can I cultivate and improve and develop what he's given me dominion over? And that's an incredibly powerful thought. Last week, I spent a couple hours in a used car dealership, and I noticed that the salesmen in there have a lot of free time. They basically just wait for someone to walk in or someone to call, and they don't have a lot to do between them. So I was asking the guy I was working with, I was like, what do you do with all your free time? He said it's one of the hardest parts of this job, because if you don't do something productive, if I just sit here and surf the internet with my free time, I'm not very good at my work, but sometimes it's hard to know what to do. So there's an example right there. He has dominion over a lot of time.
Yeah.
Some of which it's not told him exactly what he's supposed to be doing with that time, except look ready in case someone walks in. And so it's an empowering thought to go, I have all this time. What can I do? How can I steward and cultivate this time?
Yeah. I think that's such a helpful example. And I'd like to, if there are women listening to podcasts, I'd like to invite them into this conversation more, because I think one of the challenges is that if it's unusual to have conversations like this in a church context, which I love that here at Fellowship Denver we're talking about this, it's almost non-existent for women to be having conversations about integrating their faith and work. And so there are tons of consequences to that. One is for women that maybe for a season of their life are focusing on working in the home, they can feel lost or falling through the cracks of like, my work doesn't matter. And to realize, like, it's funny to say that they have dominion, but they have tremendous leadership over a unique sphere of influence, and empowering them and giving them a vision to do that. On the far other end of the spectrum, you'll have women that have incredible leadership and influence. Their dominion is powerful and broad, and we aren't discipling and affirming and supporting them, that they can feel very isolated because there just is no support or conversation for them around that. And so you realize, like, oh, this is deeply important. If we want to see, like, the full gifts of the people of God employed for his redemptive purposes in the world, then we need this integrated view of faith that informs the way they go about their work for everyone, regardless of age or gender or type of work they're doing. I preached it.
Thanks, Joanna.
That's great.
You did. So every one of us, you included this short little quote here, Joanna, from Andy Crouch that says, every one of us has been called to make something of the world. And that is an invitation, as you said, that's really broad. Whether you are raising children and your work right now is at home, or whether you are in a position of influence within a company, whether you're a man or a woman, and to your point, a woman working in a place that may feel sometimes lonely or unsupported, every one of us has been called to make something of the world. And our life of faith gains a new excitement and new purpose when we see our work and relationships through this lens. And the fourth aspect of work that we're going to discuss today is work as a way to love our neighbor, or work as a way to serve and work toward the common good.
I think it's important that we end here, because we've been talking so far about the way work changes us as individuals. So work is how we provide for ourselves and our family. Work is how God shapes and forms us. Work is how we cultivate the raw material of the world. But I think it's really important to get to this point, which is work is also something we do for the benefit of others, and it creates this society. We talked about this society.
Yep.
It adds something to the society. So ultimately, part of the meaning of our work, a good chunk of the meaning of the work, is not just the effect it has on us, but it's what it does to love and serve others. And if we think that's our highest calling as followers of Jesus, as to love God and love people.
Yep.
And so this is a way God has given us to love him. We talked about that in formation, and also to love people.
Yeah, it's fascinating. We didn't talk on this, but back at some of those Old Testament roots, that the same Hebrew words describing work also are used to describe worship. And so there is that sense of we offer our whole selves to God in a loving response to him. It's a worshipful act. We worship him through every aspect of our lives, and we can worship him through our work. But also that motivation of love God drives us to love neighbor. We live out the model of Christ's sacrificial service in the way that we serve others. And I love this quote from John Calvin, who talks about the reason why we're given callings. He says, "All the gifts we possess have been bestowed by God and entrusted to us on condition that they be distributed for our neighbor's benefit." And that's a powerful thought to realize, like, God specifically gifts us not for our own advancement, but for others' good. And that pushes us to think, what does it look like to love my neighbor in this context? I can think of two examples that I've encountered in my work at Denver Institute. One is someone I consider like a hero in how he approaches his work. It's a guy named Don Flo, who owns an auto dealership. It's ironic that you mentioned auto dealerships, Hunter, but one of his motivations, he owns a whole network of dealerships on the East Coast, is he said, couple foundational values at this shop should be that it's a place of trust, because many people don't feel like they can trust an auto dealer. And it also should be a place where we love and serve our neighbors. And so he said, okay, what does that look like in the actual operations of selling a vehicle? And what has amazed me about how Don Flo approaches selling cars is that he has filtered every aspect of his operations, practical operations, through that lens. And so it affects the type of used cars they sell and the warranties that they offer and the level of reconditioning that they're given before they're sold. He said, it wouldn't be loving to my neighbor to sell them a less than worthy vehicle. Or they no longer negotiate for car prices, because he said someone should not have to pay more for a car just because they don't know how to negotiate. And so it's loving my neighbor, is working for the common good, for it to feel like it's going to be a fair price when they come in. They're not going to be taken advantage of. And it's amazing. There are probably 40 examples I could give for how they operate that's filtered through that lens. And so often we aren't pushed to think critically about our work through that lens. But when you do, it's pretty transformative. And I know other people that have done that. Like during the pandemic, there's one of the top restaurants in the country is called Canless. It's run by the Canless family in Seattle, and their business just got turned upside down by the pandemic. They've been closed for the last 9 months, and they're a fine dining restaurant. And Mark Canless would say the last thing you need in a pandemic is fine dining. It just doesn't suit the season. But the driving motivation for why they exist as a restaurant is to serve others. And so when they're open for fine dining, that means that anyone who comes in, it could be the most well-known celebrity in Seattle or somebody that's really saved all their pennies for a year to be able to come and have an anniversary dinner, will be treated with the same level of service. That is one of the few times in life where you're going to get incredible care at the hands of your wait staff at this restaurant. So in their best moments, when they're open, that's how they operate. But even now, he said, my restaurant is closed, but that doesn't mean our mission to serve others has disappeared. And so their staff has basically spent the entire year working through probably 6 or 7 different business models that allow them to be serving the people of Seattle. And it's been everything from offering a drive-in movie theater in their parking lot. They opened a community college this fall, not like a real community college, but jokingly they called it Canless Community College, as a gift to the city, where it was a form of education and entertainment and celebrating the people of the city through online courses and COVID-friendly field trips. I mean, it was an amazing endeavor, but it was all given as a gift of service and encouragement to the people of Seattle. And I just think that's what happens when your vision and your heart are aligned to God's purposes. It creates a new drive and a new enthusiasm for the way you go about your work. My prayer is for our community here at Fellowship is that we'd have more people that are living that kind of enthusiasm and creativity out.
It's a great charge. And all of us can identify people who are impacted by our work. It might be other people we work with. It might be someone who we work for, but it might be customers. But all of us can identify someone who's impacted by our work. And to now think about how our work impacts them and can make them better is a really life-giving thought.
Yeah. And fun. And hard. But it energizes the way we go about our work.
Yeah. I'm mindful that in that way, we continue the pattern that we were invited into as well. God created, he looked at it, he said it was good, and he placed mankind in it. And there are things about the creation and the creation account that indicate to us that it was also for the good of man, for the people who he placed there, for their maturation and eventual glorification, and that this is a way in reflecting that idea that the creation and the participation in that we're invited into is a way in which we continue on that pattern when we serve others through our work and ask, how does this magnify this good, the common good?
Yeah, we live with God in all of life. Sometimes I think we just haven't been trained to understand how and why we live with God in our daily work.
Well, that's the point of this podcast. It's about learning to see that in all dimensions of life. And today's been a great conversation about one that's really important and where most of us spend most of our lives. So maybe we should just talk about this every week.
I could talk about this every week.
There are, in sort of bringing these back around, I think there's this theme that you have brought up in some past episodes, Hunter. When I listened to our conversation today, work as provision, work as formation, work as cultivation, work for love of neighbor, that all of these have this sense of pouring out or giving of ourselves, which is true. And that also repeats the pattern. God gave of himself and poured into creation and mankind, and we carry on that pattern. But that also sometimes, I think, feels a bit sort of, well, it's very countercultural in that it may not sound very self-fulfilling, but there is this interesting way in which when we look for the meaning that God has woven into our work and into the way he set up work, when we have this bigger vision for work, that it actually is affecting something in our hearts as well.
Yeah.
And that it actually does work towards our happiness when we participate with God in this way and learn to see work in this way, in the way that he made it.
Well, and that's why we want to help people see the meaning that's already there and that God's already put in their work, because ultimately it will make work more joyful. It won't make it not work, but it will make it more joyful.
Yeah, I think of that example I mentioned earlier about the auto dealer, Don Flo. I'm probably the biggest faith and work nerd because I listened to Don Flo tell his story, and it reduces me to tears because I think, how might our world be different if people that followed Christ brought that level of depth of thought and deep spiritual commitment to the way they did their jobs? I think our world would be a fundamentally different place. And so there's a call and an invitation for us to press in harder to better understand how we live out the redemptive work of the gospel in our daily work.
A couple of questions, if you want to think about this more, just pulling a couple of questions from our conversation today. Some things to continue, as Hunter says, to noodle on. To noodle on this week.
Noodle, 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 noodle.
That's right. That's right. Often Hunter will say he has an idea he's noodling on. So if
I love that metaphor.
if you want something,
I think that's because your brain looks like a bowl of noodles.
Yeah.
it
Yeah,
kind of does.
that's
It
right.
kind of does. So if you want something regarding faith and work to noodle on this week, here are a couple of questions that we raised in today's episode that you can continue to think on. What has God given you dominion over? Where do you have influence? And then another question is, how do you factor the needs of the world around you into the work you do and into the way you work? So those are just a couple of questions to keep thinking about this. And then, Joanna, there are some specific opportunities through Denver Institute for Faith and Work.
Yeah.
So can you
I
clue
would
us into
invite
those?
people at the most surface level to check out the Denver Institute website because we have tons of resources there. So you can go to denverinstitute.org. You can hear all kinds of podcast episodes and different conversations. We have 2 immediate opportunities for the Fellowship Denver community. The first is going to happen on Friday, March 26th. It's called Business for the Common Good. Ironic that we were just talking about the broader purposes of work. It's a day-long in-person and online conference exploring a vision for work, what it looks like to really create good God-honoring work in the business sector, and how do we love our neighbor better through our job. And we're going to have some amazing, for me, folks that feel like kind of heroes of the faith for the way they integrate their faith into the work, including Don Flo, the auto dealer I've mentioned before. He's going to be interviewed in the day. What's great about it is we're doing it in a COVID-friendly way. So we're going to be having a tiny in-person gathering at a hotel downtown, live streamed to host sites or individual viewers around the nation. So if people want to, Fellowship Denver is hosting a site, which is going to be really fun. It'll be COVID appropriate on that Friday, March 26th. Or if you're in another part of the country and you can't join a host site, you can always watch online, and you can find more information about that either through Fellowship Denver and some of our promotion in the weeks ahead, or at denverinstitute.org. And the second opportunity is really for local folks. It's something called the 5280 Fellowship, which is a 9-month intensive discipleship and formation program for folks that are kind of in the early to midpoint of their career. We want you to have worked for a few years, not just right out of college, but it's an amazing experience. And the application period for that starts March 1st. You can go to 5280fellows.com. And Hunter, you've seen a number of our members go through that. Would you put your own spin on why someone would want to do the fellowship?
We've had a number of Fellowship Denver members do the Fellows program, and I've had some personal friends who have done it. And I have seen a drastic difference in 9 months about how they think about their faith. They just come alive as a way of starting to connect some of these dots in ways that faith used to be kind of isolated to one segment of their life, and they're just seeing it in so much bigger terms. So I can't recommend it highly enough. I'm really excited about the Fellows program, and hope we get many more Fellowship Denver alumni into it and out of it.
Joanna, Hunter, thanks for joining me today on the podcast. I've enjoyed our conversation.
Thanks,
too.
Autumn.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joanna.
Thanks for joining us on the Vision for Life podcast. Thanks to Adam Englund for our theme music, and to our producer, Jesse Cowan.